The current grabbed her like a fist and pulled. Her body, limp and useless, was being dragged toward a wall of jagged rocks. Her hair fanned out in the rushing water, a dark, tangled mess. That's when Foster Hale saw her. His boots had just hit the soft mud of the riverbank when he spotted the pale shape bobbing in the rapids. He didn't hesitate. His saddlebag hit the ground. His colt followed. His eyes were locked on her, a ghost being pulled downstream. He dove in. The water was a shock, so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 knives. It was wild, angry, slamming against his ribs, trying to suck him under. He fought it. His arms sliced through the current, his muscles screaming as he pushed toward her. Her dress was a balloon around her, snagged on something sharp beneath the surface. One of her boots was gone. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. He finally reached her, gritting his teeth against the cold, and wrapped a powerful arm around her chest. The river tried to steal her back. Foster held on, kicked with everything he had, and dragged them both toward the shore. They collapsed into the mud, a heap of soaked limbs and gasping breaths. She didn't move. "Damn it," he muttered, rolling her onto her side. He pressed his ear to her chest. A heartbeat. Faint, but it was there. He tilted her head back, cupped her face in his rough hands. "You're not dying today," she choked. A torrent of river water spilled from her mouth. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, then slid shut again. He let out a sharp breath and, with a grunt, scooped her into his arms. The trail to his small camp was steep, slick with mud, but he didn't slow. He climbed, his boots sliding, her dead weight a terrifying burden. He set her down gently by the cold fire pit and covered her with his own coat. She was young, maybe 23. There was dried blood on her temple and a long, angry gash on her forearm. Her skin was like ice. He worked fast, stoking the fire until it roared to life, wrapping another one of his blankets around her small frame. He sat beside her, the ache in his muscles not from the river but from the cold fist of fear that had clenched his heart when he saw her. He'd come out here to trap beaver, to get away from the heavy silence of his father's grave. He hadn't expected to find a half-drowned woman. He hadn't expected this. When she finally stirred, the sun was a bleeding line of orange on the horizon. Her eyes opened slowly, clouded with confusion. They were blue, sharp as cracked ice. "Where?" "You're safe," Foster said, his voice low and steady. He knelt beside her. "I pulled you from the water. You hit your head pretty bad." She blinked, her gaze traveling from his face to the crackling fire. Her voice was a raw whisper. "I fell. Looks that way. You remember anything?" A long pause, her brow furrowed in concentration. "My horse. It spooked. I was crossing the creek. I think I hit a rock." Foster nodded. It made sense. "You got lucky. The rapids would have taken you if I hadn't been here." She swallowed hard, a flicker of something in her eyes. "Thank you." He just shrugged, though his chest felt tight. "Couldn't just leave you to drown." She tried to sit up, but a sharp wince of pain stopped her. He steadied her, his hand gentle on her back. She didn't pull away. "I'm Foster Hale," he said. "Been camped here 3 days now." She gave a faint nod. "Caitlin Tabor. I was riding from my uncle's homestead, near Billings. I was trying to reach Deer Creek before nightfall." "Well," he said, the corner of his mouth ticking up slightly, "you didn't make it." Her lips twitched in a weak ghost of a smile. "No, I suppose I didn't." He handed her a tin cup of warm water. She drank it slowly, then leaned back, her eyes closing again. He found himself watching her hands. They were calloused, but there was no ring, no sign of a husband waiting for her. The wave of relief that washed over him was ridiculous, but it was real. "You got family?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Her voice was flat, empty. "My parents died last winter. Typhoid. My Uncle James took me in, but he didn't much want me." Foster nodded slowly. He knew that kind of man. the kind who saw another person as just another burden. I know that kind. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to make her shoulders relax, just a little. That night, Caitlin slept by the fire, wrapped in his blankets, and Foster kept watch. The moonlight traced the dried blood on her cheek. He found himself staring at her face for far too long, then looked away, a strange heat curling in his gut. He wasn't the kind of man who rescued women. He'd driven cattle, shot 2 men in self-defense, and been on his own since he was 16. He was a hard man living a hard life. But when he saw her in that river, none of that had mattered. He had just jumped, and now he had no idea what to do next. By morning, Caitlin could sit up on her own. She held his coat tightly around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the churning river. "I should have died," she whispered. "You didn't," he said simply, handing her a cup of boiled coffee. "I don't know what happens now." He let the silence sit for a moment. "You could head on to Deer Creek, once you're steady." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the warm cup. I don't want to go back to my uncle's place." He looked at her, saw the shadow in her eyes. "Then don't." Caitlin blinked, surprised by his directness. "Just like that? You're a grown woman. You don't owe him anything if he didn't want you." She stared down into her coffee, her reflection rippling on the dark surface. "I need work, a place to stay." Foster rubbed the back of his neck, a familiar, nervous gesture. "Well, I've got a cabin near Miles City. It's small, but I could use some help fixing it up." Her eyes shot up to his, wide and searching. "You would let me come with you?" "I'm not gonna leave you out here alone." She studied him for a long, quiet moment. He could feel her gaze weighing him, measuring him. "You don't even know me." "I saw enough to know you're worth saving," he said, and the words felt truer than anything he'd said in years. The quiet stretched between them, thick with unspoken possibilities. Caitlin finally looked down, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "You scared me coming out of that river. For a second I thought you were a dream." Foster allowed himself a small smile. "No dream. Just a cowboy who got lucky." She met his eyes, and her own were serious. "No," she said. "I was the one who got lucky." His throat felt tight. He stood up, brushing dirt from his coat. "We should pack up. If you're sure you want to come with me, we can ride by noon." "I'm sure," she said, and there was a strength in her voice that hadn't been there before. She meant it. By mid-afternoon, they were riding side by side through the tall, whispering grass. Her horse, which he'd found grazing downstream, was skittish, but manageable. Caitlin's hair was still damp, her face pale and bruised, but she sat straighter in the saddle than she had that morning. A new resolve had settled over her. Foster glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "You ever helped build a roof?" he asked. She gave him a sideways look. "I can learn. I have no doubt." They rode in silence for a while, the sun warm on their backs. Foster kept thinking about the way her fingers had curled around the cup, the way she'd looked at him like he was more than just some stranger who'd stumbled upon her. He'd never had a woman share his fire before. He'd never wanted one to, until now. When they reached the edge of a wide valley, Caitlin slowed her horse. "Why did you come out here all alone?" Foster hesitated, the question stirring things he preferred to keep buried. "I lost my father last year. Needed to be somewhere quiet." "I'm sorry," she said softly. He just nodded. "He wasn't an easy man, but he was mine." Caitlin looked out at the vast horizon. "Maybe we both lost things we can't get back." He looked at her, at the line of her jaw, the determination in her eyes. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe we get to build something new." She met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. Maybe we do. They rode on, the wind tugging at their clothes. The river was far behind them now, a bad memory fading with the miles. But the current between them, that had only just begun to pull. It was a strange feeling, riding with someone else. For years, the only sounds had been the wind, his horse, and the thoughts rattling around in his own head. Now, there was the soft creak of her saddle, the occasional sigh from her horse, the quiet rhythm of another person's breathing. It wasn't bad. It wasn't bad at all. The trail narrowed, dipping into a thicket of cottonwoods that leaned in low, their leaves whispering secrets in the breeze. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. She held the reins easily, her posture relaxed, like she'd been born on a horse. "You worked cattle before?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "No," she said, brushing a stray piece of wind-blown hair from her face. "My father kept sheep. I helped with the shearing, but horses, they were never mine to handle." He nodded once. "You ride like they were." She didn't answer right away, just adjusted her seat and looked toward the distant hills. "I spent a lot of time alone. The animals were easier to be around than people." Foster kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "People do damage animals, don't?" "Most do," she said, and then after a long pause, "Have you always been out this way?" "No," he said. "Born outside Abilene, back before Texas got sliced up with rail lines and fences. My folks moved north when I was a boy, settled near Fort Keogh before it was even a real post." "You didn't stay," she observed, her voice drifting on the wind. "Went where the work was." He glanced at her. "But I've had my fill of drifting." She didn't speak again until they stopped to water the horses at a quiet, winding creek. The place was peaceful, shaded by a stand of willows. Caitlin knelt beside the water, rinsing the dust from her hands. She looked up as he unsaddled his pack mule. "Why the cabin?" she asked. "Why not just keep going?" He crouched to check the mule's hoof, his back to her. "Got tired of asking other men for a bed and a meal. Land's cheap if you know where to look. I built the place for myself. You live there alone." "Until now." She stood, brushing her skirts clean. "That doesn't scare you? The quiet?" He straightened up then and gave her a look that held. "No," he said. "Quiet's not the same as being alone." They reached his land by dusk the next day. The final stretch of the trail was a narrow ridge that climbed steeply. When they crested the top, the cabin came into view. It was small, squared off, built from rough-hewn logs. A simple sod roof and a single stovepipe pointed at the sky like a stubborn finger. Caitlin's horse slowed as she took it all in. "That's yours?" He nodded, a swell of pride in his chest. "Built it last fall. Floors are dry, roof don't leak, and the door holds against the wind." She said nothing, just nudged her mare forward. He watched her eyes move across the place, the half-finished split-rail fence, the lean-to for the animals, the neat rows of young corn just starting to sprout from the tilled soil. It wasn't much, but it was his. Inside, the cabin was bare-boned but clean, a narrow cot in one corner, a simple table with a lantern, a stove blackened from use. He set down her things and motioned to the bed. "You take that. I'll sleep under the lean-to until I can build another frame. I don't want you sleeping outside on my account." "I'm not made of glass, Caitlin." She stepped past him, her fingers tracing the line of the windowsill. "You built this. With your own hands." "I did." She turned, her eyes still on the rough walls. "Then I'll help you make it livable." Foster took off his hat, hanging it on a nail by the door. "You already have." That night something felt different. He cooked beans and cornmeal on the stove while she sorted through the supplies he'd hauled in the week before. She found a tin of dried apples and handed it to him without a word. He opened it and added a few to the pot. "You always cook like this?" she asked, neatly stacking kindling for the morning fire. "Only when there's someone else to feed," he said. She smiled, a quiet, private thing. and didn't look at him. Later, after the bedding was arranged and the fire was banked low, he stepped outside. The chill night air felt good on his skin. The sky was incredible. A black velvet cloth littered with so many stars, it made a man feel both impossibly small and strangely seen. He stood there for a long time, arms crossed, just listening to the wind moving through the tall grass. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Caitlin stepped out, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. Her hair was loose for the first time, tumbling over her shoulders. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. He didn't answer, just shifted to make room for her on the stoop. She sat, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "There's a stillness here," she said after a while. "It's not like the kind that comes after a lot of shouting." "No," he agreed. "It's the kind that comes before something begins." She didn't speak, and he didn't press her. They just sat there in the dark, two lonely figures outlined by starlight, their breaths mingling in the cold air. After what felt like a long time, she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I don't want to leave." "You don't have to," he said, his own voice rough. She turned to him, her face a pale oval in the darkness, unreadable. "You'd let me stay? Just like that?" "There's an empty side to that table," he said, looking out at his land. "And it's a life that could use more than one pair of hands. If you want it." Caitlin looked down at her feet, bare against the cool wood of the porch. "I don't know what I'm good for anymore." "You're alive," he said, turning to look at her fully. "That's enough for a start." She reached over then, slow and deliberate, and took his hand. Her fingers were rough with old work, the gash on her arm still healing. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just let her hold on, her small hand a warm weight in his. And in that shared silence, something shifted. There were no grand declarations, no breathless promises. There were just two people sitting in the dark with the heavy weight of the past behind them and the faint, hopeful shape of something new beginning to form right there between them. But he should have noticed the way she flinched when a twig snapped in the woods. He should have asked more questions. He was so focused on building a future, he never stopped to properly examine the past she was running from. And that was a mistake that would nearly cost them everything. By the second week, they had fallen into a rhythm. It was a quiet, steady thing, like a slow-moving river. Caitlin was up before the first hint of dawn, boiling water for the wash basin. Foster would be out back, the sharp crack of his axe splitting kindling echoing in the cool morning air. They didn't talk much in the mornings. They didn't need to. A nod here, a gesture there. It was enough to know what needed doing. She moved through the small cabin with a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and he felt the difference in his bones. The place was no longer just a shelter. It was starting to feel like a home. The roof still needed work. One of the main beams wasn't braced properly, so Foster spent the better part of a day up on a ladder, while Caitlin held it steady below. She had started wearing a pair of his old trousers under her skirt when they worked outside, the hem of her dress pinned up to keep it from dragging in the dirt. She hadn't asked his permission. He hadn't offered an opinion. It just was. "You ever do carpentry before?" he asked, grunting as he pried a rusted nail from a joist with the claw of his hammer. "No," she said, squinting up at him, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. "But I mended fence posts with my father, and I've watched enough men build things to know most of them do it wrong." He glanced down at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You offering a critique?" "An observation," she said, her tone serious. "You've got your support angled too narrow. Come the first heavy snow, it's going to buckle. You'll want it wider." He paused, looking at the angle of the brace. He looked at the line of the roof. He looked back at the brace. She was right. Without another word, he shifted the beam. She nodded once, a quick, sharp gesture of approval. "Good." That night, after a simple supper of rabbit stew, he found her standing by the pasture fence. Her arms were folded tight around herself, and she was staring out into the deepening twilight. The moon was just a thin, silver sliver, and the grass whispered under a restless wind. He walked up beside her, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her shoulder. "You're not sleeping much," he said. It wasn't a question. "I hear things at night," she replied, her voice low. "Owls, branches snapping. Sometimes I think I hear hooves." He followed her gaze to the dark, imposing tree line at the edge of his property. "There's nothing out there that means you any harm." She didn't answer right away. Then, so quietly he almost didn't hear her, she said, "I used to listen for my uncle's steps on the porch. He had a way of coming home quiet when he was in one of his moods." Foster didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, a solid presence beside her until the wind shifted and she let out a long, slow breath. "I don't wake up afraid anymore," she added, as if to reassure him. "Just alert." "You can take your time," he said. "This place isn't asking anything of you." She turned to him then, her blue eyes searching his face in the gloom. "You really don't expect anything?" He met her gaze without flinching. "I expect you to be honest. That's all." Her face softened, the tension around her mouth easing, and for the first time, she stepped closer, not for warmth, not for shelter, but just to be near him. She stood so close he could hear the steady rhythm of her breathing. "I think I'd forgotten what that felt like," she whispered. "To be honest." The days that followed brought a dry, strong wind that pushed the clouds eastward and baked the mud in the yard into a network of cracked lines. Foster repaired the lean-to, replacing rotten boards and securing the roof. Caitlin cleared a corner of the yard, turning the soil for a small vegetable patch. She worked with a quiet, fierce determination, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her hair tied back with a simple strip of cloth. He watched her once, as she paused her digging and leaned on the shovel. She raised her face to the sun, her eyes closed, a strange, wistful expression on her face, like she was remembering something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. He didn't ask what it was. One evening, she came in from a walk with a bundle of wild sage and onion. She set it on the table and then turned toward the door again, hesitating. "I saw your name," she said, "carved into the post by the gate." "Had to mark it," he replied from the stove. "Land agent said it was mine, so I made it known." She paused, her hand on the door frame. "You ever think about carving someone else's name next to yours?" He stopped stirring the pot and looked up. "You asking for yourself?" "I'm asking if the thought has ever crossed your mind." He set the spoon down slowly and wiped his hands on a rag. "It has." She nodded once, a quick, decisive gesture, and took a seat at the table. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a new confidence in her posture. "Then maybe tomorrow," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'll go carve mine next to yours, so there's no confusion." He watched her, the slow, calm certainty in her voice, sending a warmth spreading through his chest. It felt deep and quiet, like the last stone being laid in a foundation. He had been building a cabin, but with her here, they were building a life. He thought for the first time that this might actually work, that two broken people could maybe piece together something whole. But as he looked at her sitting there, so resolute and sure, a tiny, nagging thought surfaced. She was fitting in too well. It was all too easy. People who came from hardship, like she claimed, were usually skittish, hesitant. Caitlin was adapting, almost like she'd been practicing for this role. The thought was disloyal, and he pushed it away. He was just a man who'd been alone too long, he told himself. He was forgetting how to trust. He had no idea how right that instinct was. After supper, she sat on the stoop while he cleaned up inside. The murmur of the creek and the chirping of crickets filled the night air. When he stepped outside, the moon had risen, casting long shadows across the yard. She was holding a small carving knife and a scrap of pine, her head bent in concentration. She didn't look up as he approached. "I used to whittle when I was a child," she said, her voice soft. "Nothing real, just birds mostly." He lowered himself to sit beside her on the step. Her fingers moved with a slow, practiced grace, coaxing a shape from the wood. Her thumb, he noticed, bore a small healing callus from her work in the garden. "I never had anyone to carve for," she added, her focus still on the piece of pine. "You do now," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She stopped carving. She looked at him, her face illuminated by the silvery moonlight, the curve of her cheek, the intensity in her eyes. Then slowly, surely, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a rushed, desperate kiss. There was no trembling, no uncertainty. It was a quiet meeting of two people who had come through the worst of it and had found something solid, something worth staying for. When she pulled back, he didn't say anything. He couldn't. He just rested his forehead against hers, the scent of sage and clean air filling his senses, and let the vast, silent night wrap around them. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves of the cottonwoods, and somewhere out in the darkness, a whippoorwill called its lonely song. Caitlin smiled against his skin. "I think I'll sleep soundly tonight," she whispered. Foster reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. They fit together perfectly. "You're safe, Caitlin," he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "As long as I'm breathing, you will be." But safety was an illusion, a comfortable lie they were telling themselves. Because out there, in the darkness beyond their small circle of light, something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, a low thrum of unease he couldn't name. He mistook it for love, for the fear of losing this new, fragile happiness. He was wrong. It wasn't a feeling. It was a warning. A storm was gathering, and their little cabin was directly in its path. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, gone so fast Foster thought he'd imagined it. He'd been splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comforting sound in the morning quiet. He paused, axe resting on the block, and scanned the dense woods that bordered his land. Nothing. Just the sway of the pines and the chatter of a squirrel. He shook his head, blaming the late nights and early mornings. A few days later, Caitlin was tending her garden when she suddenly went still. He was on the roof, replacing a section of sod, and saw the change in her posture immediately. Her head was cocked, her hand frozen above a row of young carrots. She was listening. "What is it?" he called down. She looked up, her face pale. "I thought I heard something. A horse." He climbed down the ladder, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He walked to the fence line and stared out across the rolling prairie. The landscape was empty, stretching out to the horizon under a vast blue sky. There was no dust cloud, no distant rider. "Just the wind," he said, turning back to her. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're right. Just the wind." But after that, the tension in her never fully went away. She started at small sounds. She spent more time looking out the cabin's single window than she did at her sewing. He tried to reassure her, telling her she was safe, that her uncle was miles away and had no reason to come looking for her. She would just nod, but the fear lingered in her eyes, a deep, dark shadow he couldn't seem to banish. He thought it was her past haunting her. He never imagined it was her future catching up. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday. The air was thick with the promise of a thunderstorm, the sky a bruised purple gray. He rode a big, black gelding, and he sat in the saddle with an easy confidence that spoke of long, hard miles. He stopped his horse at the gate and just sat there for a long moment, his eyes taking in the cabin, the lean-to, the half-finished fence. Foster had been sharpening a shovel blade. He set it down carefully and walked toward the gate, his hand resting casually near the Colt holstered on his hip. Caitlin had vanished inside the moment she saw the rider, moving so quickly and quietly she was like a ghost. "Looking for something?" Foster called out, his voice even. The man was tall and lean, with a sun-weathered face and eyes the color of faded denim. He wore a dusty coat and a flat-brimmed hat. He looked like trouble. "Maybe," the man said, his voice a low drawl. "Looking for a man, name of Foster Hale." Foster's blood went cold. "You found him." The stranger swung down from his horse. He didn't smile. "Name's Cole. I'm a bounty hunter." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a wanted poster. He unfolded it. "There's a warrant for your arrest, from a bank robbery down in Cheyenne." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Foster stared at the crudely drawn sketch on the poster. It looked vaguely like him, but it could have been any man with a square jaw and dark hair. "You've got the wrong man," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I haven't been in Cheyenne in 5 years." "That's what they all say," Cole the bounty hunter said, his gaze flicking toward the cabin door. "Witness said the robber was tall, rode a bay mare, and headed north. Matches your description." He looked back at Foster. "I'm not looking for a fight, just the $500 reward. Come along quiet, and we can do this easy." A bank robbery, a $500 reward. It was insane. He was a trapper, a homesteader. He'd never robbed anyone in his life. He was about to say so, about to argue, when he saw the curtain in the cabin window twitch. Caitlin was watching. And in that instant, everything became clear. Her fear, her constant vigilance, the way she jumped at every sound. It wasn't about her uncle. It had never been about her uncle. She was afraid someone was coming for him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This woman, who he had taken in, who he had started to care for, had known all along. She had known he was a wanted man, and she hadn't said a word. The quiet life they were building, the trust, the gentle touches, the shared dreams. Was it all a lie? "I'm not going with you," Foster said, his voice flat and hard. His hand moved from his side and settled firmly on the grip of his Colt. The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed. "Don't be a fool, Hale. You can't outrun this." "Watch me," Foster said. The storm broke then, the sky opening up with a deafening crack of thunder. Rain began to fall in thick, heavy sheets. And in the space of a single heartbeat, Foster Hale's carefully constructed world had been completely and utterly shattered. The woman in his cabin wasn't a victim he'd rescued. She was the keeper of a secret that was about to get them both killed. The bounty hunter, Cole, didn't draw. He was a patient man. He just stood there in the pouring rain, a grim smile playing on his lips. "I'll be back, Hale. You can't hide forever. And when I come back, I'm bringing a posse." He swung himself back onto his horse, turned the big gelding around, and rode off at a slow, deliberate pace, disappearing into the gray curtain of the storm. Foster stood frozen for a long moment, the rain plastering his hair to his head, his shirt soaked through. He didn't feel the cold. All he felt was a hollow, ringing silence in his ears. He turned and walked back to the cabin, his boots heavy with mud and betrayal. He pushed the door open. Caitlin was standing by the table, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Her face was a mask of terror. "You knew," he said. It wasn't a question. She flinched as if he'd struck her. "Foster, I can explain." "Can you?" He shot back, his voice raw. "Can you explain why there's a bounty hunter at my door? Can you explain the $500 reward on my head for a bank robbery I didn't commit?" He stalked across the small room, his anger a living thing between them. All this time, you knew. Every word you said, every look. Was it all a lie? No. Foster, please, she begged, tears welling in her eyes. I wanted to tell you. I was just so scared. Scared of what? Scared of me? Or scared that your free ride was about to end? The words were cruel, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop them. The image of their life together, so hopeful and new, was crumbling into dust around him. I was scared for you, she cried. I heard men talking in Billings before I left my uncle's. They were talking about the robbery, about a man who matched your description heading this way. When I fell in the river and you saved me, I saw your face, and I knew. But I also saw that you were a good man. You weren't a killer. You weren't a thief. I didn't want them to find you. He stared at her, searching her face for the truth. Her story was plausible. It could be true, but trust, once broken, was a hard thing to mend. So you just decided not to mention it? Let me build this life. Let me think we had a future, all while knowing that at any moment a man with a rope could show up at my door? I was wrong, she whispered, tears streaming down her face now. I was so wrong. I should have told you, but I was selfish. I was happy here. For the first time in my life, I felt safe. I didn't want to lose that. The fight went out of him then, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. He sank onto the edge of the cot and buried his face in his hands. What did it matter now? The bounty hunter was coming back. His life, their life, was over before it had even truly begun. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the drumming of the rain on the sod roof. The anger cooled, leaving a bitter residue of fear. He looked at her. She was huddled in a chair, looking small and fragile, her face streaked with tears. Was she a liar, or was she just a scared woman who had made a terrible mistake? We have to leave, he said finally, his voice flat. Pack what you can carry. We'll head north into the mountains. We can lose them there. She looked up, a flicker of hope in her eyes. We? I'm not leaving you here for them to find, he said gruffly. They'll ask questions. They'll know you were with me. He stood up and began to move, his actions sharp and efficient. He grabbed his saddlebags, emptying them onto the floor. Dried meat, a whetstone, extra ammunition. He was a man on the run now. The life he had dreamed of was gone. Caitlin watched him for a moment. Then she stood up and began to pack her own small bundle of belongings. Her movements were jerky, clumsy with fear. As she reached for the spare blanket on the cot, her hand brushed against his saddlebag. She froze. Her eyes went wide. She reached into the bag, her fingers closing around something heavy, something that clinked softly. Slowly, she pulled her hand out. In her palm lay a small, heavy leather pouch. She pulled at the drawstring, her hands trembling. With a soft, metallic sigh, a cascade of gold coins spilled onto the rough wool of the blanket. Double eagles. Dozens of them. Far, far too many for a simple trapper and homesteader. It was a fortune. It was bank money. She looked up at him, her face a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. The tears were gone, replaced by a chilling certainty. You lied to me, she whispered. The accusation hung in the air, heavier than the storm outside. The trust he had questioned in her was now a weapon turned back on him. He had sworn he was innocent. But the proof of his guilt, cold and hard and golden, was lying right there between them. And in that moment he knew he was being framed. But how could he ever make her believe him now? The trap had been sprung. Foster stared at the gold coins, a cold dread washing over him. That's not mine, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Caitlin, I've never seen that pouch before in my life. She backed away from him, her hand flying to her mouth. Don't lie to me again. The bounty hunter, the wanted poster, it's all true. Her eyes, once so full of warmth, were now filled with a chilling mixture of fear and disgust. "You saved my life only to drag me into yours. You're a thief." "No." He took a step toward her, his hands held out in a placating gesture. "Listen to me. Someone put it there. It's a setup." "Who?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Who would do that? The squirrels? A ghost? No one's been near this cabin but you and me for weeks." He stopped, the frantic denial dying on his lips. She was right. It made no sense, unless the person who put it there had been with him all along. His eyes snapped to hers. The thought was monstrous, unthinkable. But the bounty hunter showing up, the perfectly timed discovery of the gold, it was all too convenient. "You," he breathed, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "You did this. You planted it." Her face crumpled. "Me? You think Foster? How can you say that?" The tears started again, but this time they looked different. They looked like the tears of a cornered animal. He ignored them. His mind was racing, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Her convenient fall into the river, right where he would find her. Her story of the cruel uncle, a story designed to win his sympathy. Her fear, which he had mistaken for trauma, but was actually guilt. "The bounty hunter. You didn't just hear about me in Billings. You led him here." "That's not true!" she shrieked. "Isn't it?" he pressed, advancing on her. "You needed a place to hide. You needed a fool to take the fall for you. You found me. A lonely man with a bit of land, no family, no one to ask questions. I was perfect, wasn't I?" "Stop it!" But he couldn't stop. The betrayal was a poison, and he had to get it out. "What did you do, Caitlin? Whose blood is on that gold?" She scrambled backwards, her eyes wild with panic. She tripped over a stool and fell to the floor. She looked up at him, her face a mess of tears and terror. "It's not what you think." The cabin door burst open. Framed in the doorway, dripping with rain, stood a man. He wasn't old and frail like the Uncle Caitlin had described. This man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a hard, cruel face and eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. He held a pistol in each hand, both of them aimed directly at Foster. "Well, well," the man said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his lips. "Looks like the party's started without me." He stepped into the cabin, his boots thudding on the wood floor. His eyes flicked from Foster to the gold coins glittering on the bed, and then to Caitlin, cowering on the floor. "Get up, wife," the man snarled. Foster's world stopped. Wife. The word was a gunshot in the silent room. This wasn't her uncle. This was her husband. "James," Caitlin whispered, her voice trembling. The man, James, laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You've been a busy girl, haven't you, Katie? Found yourself a new man, a new home. Did you really think you could run from me?" He took another step into the room, his pistols never wavering from Foster's chest. Everything was a lie, every single word. The fall from the horse, the cruel uncle, the dead parents. A carefully constructed fiction designed to lure him in. She wasn't a victim, she was a fugitive. And she had used him, his home, his trust, as a shield. "She told me you were her uncle," Foster said, his voice dangerously low, his eyes locked on James. James's smile widened. Did she now? She always was a creative little thing. "The truth is, my dear wife here decided she was entitled to a larger share of our earnings." His gaze dropped to the gold. "She ran off with that pouch after our little business transaction in Cheyenne. I've been tracking her ever since." So that was it. They were partners, bank robbers, and she had run out on him, taking part of the score with her. "Looks like she found the perfect place to hide it," James continued, his eyes glittering with greed. "And the perfect fool to blame it on." He gestured with one of his pistols toward Foster. "Sorry, friend. Looks like your luck's run out. You take the blame, I take the gold, and I take my wife back." He started to move toward Caitlin. Foster reacted without thinking. He dove to the side, grabbing for his own Colt, which lay on the table. James fired. The bullet splintered the wood of the table, inches from Foster's hand. James fired again. The second shot ripped through the fleshy part of Foster's shoulder. The pain was a hot, searing agony. He crashed to the floor, his arm useless. James laughed again and turned his attention back to Caitlin. "Now, where were we?" he said, reaching down to grab her arm. But something in Caitlin had snapped. The terror in her eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fury. She had been running for weeks, living in fear, and it was all over. Her plan had failed, but she wasn't going back. Not with him. As James hauled her to her feet, she twisted in his grip. With a guttural scream, she grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the cold stove and swung it with all her might. The skillet connected with the side of James's head with a sickening crack. His eyes rolled back in his head. His grip on her arm loosened. The two pistols fell from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. And then he collapsed, a dead weight at her feet. Silence. The only sound was the rain, the frantic pounding of Foster's heart, and Caitlin's ragged, desperate breaths. She stood over her husband's unconscious body, the skillet still clutched in her hand, her chest heaving. She looked at Foster, who was struggling to sit up, his face pale with pain and shock. The lie was broken. The truth was out. And it was uglier than anything he could have ever imagined. She dropped the skillet. It landed with a loud clang that made them both jump. She knelt by Foster's side, her hands fluttering near his wounded shoulder. "Foster, I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" he gritted out, the pain making his vision swim. "You lied about everything." "Not everything," she said, her voice desperate. "It started as a lie. Yes. I needed to disappear. I needed someone to take the fall if he found me. I stole that money from him because he was going to kill me. He said I was a loose end, so I ran. The fall in the river, that was real. I was desperate. My horse had thrown me for real, and I was at the end of my rope. Finding you, that was just luck." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "When I got here, I was just playing a part. I was going to use you and leave. But then, something happened. I saw the way you lived, the quiet, the kindness. You built this place with your hands. You were good. And I started to feel things I'd never felt before. I started to want this life. For real." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle. "I fell in love with you, Foster. That wasn't a lie. I was going to tell you everything, I swear. I was just trying to find the right time, the right words. I didn't want to lose you." He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to believe her. But his shoulder was on fire, her murderous husband was lying on his floor, and a bounty hunter was on his way back with a posse. As if summoned by the thought, the cabin door swung open again. It was Cole, the bounty hunter. He stood in the doorway, his shotgun leveled, his eyes taking in the scene with a cold, professional calm. He saw James unconscious on the floor. He saw the spilled gold coins. He saw Caitlin kneeling beside Foster, her hands stained with his blood, and he saw the pistol on the floor near Foster's outstretched hand. "Looks like I missed the fun," Cole said, his voice flat. He stepped inside, kicking one of James's pistols away. "All right, Hale. Your story just got a lot more complicated." Caitlin stood up, placing herself between the bounty hunter and Foster. "It wasn't him," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "It was my husband, James Tabor. He's the one who robbed the bank in Cheyenne." Cole raised a skeptical eyebrow. "That's a convenient story, ma'am, especially since the wanted poster is for this man here." "The witness description was vague," Caitlin pressed, her mind working furiously. "Tall, dark hair, rode a bay mare north. That describes half the men in this territory. It describes my husband. She pointed a trembling finger at the man on the floor. He was the one who was in Cheyenne. I was with him. I ran from him. Foster found me. He took me in. He knew nothing about any of this. James tracked me here to get his money back and kill us both. Cole looked from her to Foster, who was now sitting up, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked at the unconscious man on the floor. Then his eyes settled on the pile of gold. He knelt and picked up one of the coins, turning it over in his fingers. This is bank money, all right, he mused. He looked back at Caitlin. It's a good story, but how do I know you're not just trying to save your new lover's skin? Because I was going to let him take the fall, she said, the confession ripping from her. I planted that gold in his bag. I was going to let you take him because I was a coward, but I'm not a coward anymore. She looked at Foster, her heart in her eyes. I won't let an innocent man hang for something my husband did, or for something I did. Silence descended on the cabin again. Cole stood up, his face unreadable. He looked at Foster, whose face was tight with pain, but whose eyes were clear and steady. He looked at Caitlin, who stood her ground, defiant and terrified. He looked at the greed and violence-etched face of the man on the floor. Cole had been a bounty hunter for 20 years. He'd seen every kind of lie, every kind of deception, but he also knew the look of truth when he saw it. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his shotgun. "Ma'am," he said to Caitlin, "you're going to have to ride into Miles City and tell this whole story to the marshal. Every last word of it." He then looked at Foster. "And you better hope she's as convincing with him as she was with me." He nudged James with the toe of his boot. "I'll be taking Mr. Tabor here off your hands. The reward for bank robbery is $500. The reward for being a horse's ass is getting dragged to jail behind my gelding." He produced a pair of handcuffs and hauled James's limp body up, cuffing his hands behind his back. He slung him over his shoulder like a sack of grain and headed for the door. He paused on the threshold and looked back at them. "Hail," he said. "You're a lucky man." Then he turned and disappeared into the rain. They were alone again. The storm outside was finally starting to break, the rain softening to a drizzle. The truth, raw and painful and ugly, lay between them. Caitlin slowly walked over to Foster and knelt beside him again. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat and began to tend to his wound, her hands gentle and sure. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his mind a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and a strange, stubborn flicker of the love he had felt for her. She had lied. She had used him. She had almost gotten him killed, but she had also saved him. In the end, when it mattered most, she had chosen him. She had chosen the truth. "Foster," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Can you ever forgive me?" He looked around the small cabin. At the walls he had built, the table where they had shared their meals, the cot where he had dreamed of a future with her. It was all built on a lie. But maybe it could be rebuilt on the truth. "Ask me again when the marshal lets me go," he said, his voice rough. But he reached out his good hand and placed it over hers, his fingers curling around her wrist. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. Years passed. The story of the bank robber's wife and the innocent homesteader became a local legend in Miles City, a cautionary tale told over whiskey in the saloon. James Tabor was sent to prison, and Foster Hale was cleared of all charges. He and Caitlin never spoke of that day again. They didn't need to. The memory of it lived in the silence between them, a scar that had healed but would never fully fade. They rebuilt. Slowly, carefully, they laid a new foundation, not of lies and desperation, but of hard work, shared glances, and a quiet, stubborn love. The cabin grew. A second room was added, and then a barn. The half-finished fence was completed, enclosing a field of healthy corn and a small herd of cattle. Children's laughter eventually filled the air, chasing away the last of the ghosts. The sunflowers Caitlin planted along the fence grew tall and strong, turning their faces to the sun. Neighbors came to know them not for the scandal they had survived, but for the life they had built. A home where no voice was ever raised in fear, where every kindness was remembered, and where the wind sweeping through the tall grass sounded like peace. Sometimes, on a quiet evening, Foster would look at his wife as she sat by the fire, her hands busy with mending, and he would remember the half-drowned woman he pulled from the river. He would remember the bounty hunter, the spilled gold, and the taste of betrayal. But then he would look at the home around them, at the children sleeping soundly in their beds, and he would feel her hand find his in the firelight. She had been a lie he chose to believe, and in the end, she had become his truth. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had been the lucky one after all. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal and redemption, and you want to hear more tales that prove the truth is often stranger than fiction, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what secrets the next story will uncover.